Does the West really want Ukraine to win the Russo-Ukrainian war? My contention is no, they don't. At least not under the current political leadership in two very important Western allies of Ukraine. Number one, the United States, and number two, Germany, Europe's biggest economy. Привет! My name is Connor Klein, and I have a background in international relations with a specialization in the region of the Russo-Ukrainian war. I speak Ukrainian and Russian. I've been living in Ukraine for a few years before the 2022 invasion, and I'm here to give you an informed and unique and even nuanced analysis of the different policies and events occurring in the Russo-Ukrainian war. So this might come as a surprise to you if you're not very involved with the day-to-day what goes on in the Russo-Ukrainian war, because the assumption would be, well, they are allies of Ukraine, so surely they want Ukraine to win. However, we have never seen a clear strategy outlined by the most important of Ukraine's Western allies that Ukraine should actually emerge victorious from the Russo-Ukrainian war. Now, the Russo-Ukrainian war began in 2014 with Russia's invasion of Crimea and the beginning of the war in Donbass, and obviously that accelerated with the extended invasion by Russia of Ukraine in 2022. Now, at that time, the policy of the Biden administration seemed to be that they would support Ukraine and Ukraine's future government in exile, because basically they offered Volodymyr Zelensky a ride out of Kyiv, and he actually replied he needed ammo, quite famously, not a ride. And so the original strategy would seem, which they have been providing some more kind of partisan-like equipment for Ukraine, so anti-tank weapons, anti-aircraft weapons that could be handheld. That seems to have been the extent of the original strategy, and because Russia was unsuccessful with its initial invasion of Ukraine, it was not a 3-day or 30-day invasion, we're now over 1,000 days, that original strategy just obviously was superfluous. Ukraine was going to fight the Russian invasion and resist quite considerably. So the policy changed from trying to support Ukraine in its valiant and short-lived defense in face of Russian aggression to a support Ukraine as long as it takes. However, that is different when you say as long as it takes to win the war. That is very ambiguous language, and the US has increased, as well as the other allies of Ukraine, mainly in Europe. They have increased their support gradually over the last 1,000 days since the 2022 invasion began. However, importantly, the United States under Joe Biden's administration, nor Germany under Olaf Scholz's government have outlined a clear strategy that they want Ukraine to win. They certainly don't want to see Ukraine lose. That has been clear from their support, but that support has been mainly to stop Ukraine collapsing on the front, and it has not been to help Ukraine to win. And there was a significant window to assist Ukraine to win this war in late 2022, early 2023. You will remember that Ukraine liberated the city of Kherson. They also liberated a large part of Kharkiv Oblast, and since then they have only made one significant maneuver that has allowed Ukraine to capture and control a significant amount of territory, and that is actually inside of Russia in the Kursk Oblast. It's not been in Russian-occupied territory. There was the 2023 Ukrainian summer offensive that was unsuccessful in liberating large amounts of Ukrainian territory. It did liberate some territory on the margins near the line of contact, and one of the big criticisms with that offensive was that while the US and Ukraine's other Western allies did not send the necessary materiel, so military equipment, on time in order to assist Ukraine to actually be victorious there, basically Russia had plenty of time to build significant defensive fortifications that were successful. It's called the Surovikin line. The Russian General Surovikin was actually relieved of his position in the command since then, but he seems to have at least done a good job on that. Probably good for Ukraine that following the Prigozhin attempted mutiny, whatever that was that Prigozhin was trying to do, it didn't end very successfully for him, and actually Surovikin was sidelined as a result. Kind of a bit of a mystery as to why. That's a different topic. So what you see is this policy where they give enough materiel and support to Ukraine so that Ukraine does not collapse, but they do not give enough aid in order for Ukraine to actually win. And why is that? There's a very clear line of thinking, and Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, who is kind of the poster child for people who are pro-Ukrainian in terms of condemning this approach by the West. He has significant influence within the Biden administration, and he is clearly very concerned about the consequences of a Ukrainian victory. Now, number one, and that's been obvious in the last few days with a lot of this nuclear saber rattling by Vladimir Putin and his colleagues in the Kremlin, they are worried that once it is clear that Russia is going to lose, that they will do something very extreme and very desperate, like using nuclear weapons. That is actually a very small risk. The risk is always there. Russia would use nuclear weapons, but it is very small risk because, well, the chances of that actually being benefit to Russia are almost non-existent. For example, China, which is a major ally of Russia, is completely against the use of nuclear weapons, and it would not do anything significant on the battlefield if it used a tactical nuke. It would just simply slow down the inevitable, and it would likely get an enormous response from Ukraine's Western allies that would make it net negative for Russia to use. But there is always that possibility. However, the second and most likely and most justifiable reason for not supporting Ukraine to victory is the fact that once Ukraine wins, Russia will start to collapse. And back in the late 80s, early 90s, the United States faced a similar-ish situation with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had lost the war in Afghanistan, they had left, and then it started to unravel for the Soviet Union. And counter to what you might actually think, the US was not in favor of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. They didn't want to see these independent countries like Ukraine at the time because they were worried about several risks. Huge internal conflict and war in the region, which there was a certain amount of in the early 90s, late 80s in the Soviet Union as it started to disintegrate. A lot of different ethnicities or groups within the Soviet Union started to fight and squabble amongst each other for territory, for control, for power. And the most pressing concern they had were loose nukes. What would happen to the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal? Would it end up in the hands of these new states that, in the end, the Soviet Union dissolved and they split out into its 15 constituent republics? All those republics became new member states. However, the levels below that, like an autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, for example, one of those would have been, let's say, Nagorno-Karabakh. I'm pretty sure that was an autonomous republic within Azerbaijan that was ethnically Armenian. That then fought a war for independence. It was never legally recognized, and actually eventually Azerbaijan took it back, many years later. So those types of entities were not granted independence. Also, there was a war in Chechnya within the Russian Federation once it became independent. As Chechens fought for their independence, they were not entitled to that because it was not a Soviet Socialist Republic. So they were not entitled to independence according to the agreement. So in general, the US managed, and the other powers, nuclear powers, China and the United Kingdom and France, they managed to ensure that Russia's nuclear arsenal ended up, or the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal ended up in the hands of Russia, or it was just destroyed. So there were three other countries that became independent that ended up with nuclear weapons. They were Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. We have the infamous 1994 Budapest Memorandum in which they agreed to give up their nuclear arsenals in exchange for security guarantees or security assurances, which were not worth the paper they were written on, since obviously Russia just ignored all those and invaded Ukraine anyways in 2014. And now we would face a similar situation if Russia were to lose the war, because it would be a great risk of a similar collapse like the Soviet Union, in the sense that many parts of the country may start to, the central power might start to weaken, and then you may see a series of warlords or other entities that are maybe not run by warlords but have a local group that wants independence, maybe Tartarstan, maybe somewhere in the east of Russia where there are a lot of resources. There may be an incentive for the neighboring countries like China in particular to support an independence movement in the region which is very resource rich, that then they would back for independence, and obviously then they would sell those resources even cheaper than Russia's even having to do at the moment to China, or they may even decide just to annex the territory themselves. China arguably has historical claims to parts of the Primorsky Oblast, which is where Vladivostok is in Russia, and actually we've seen China take effective control of an island just near to Khabarovsk, which is another city in Russia's far east, which is maybe the beginnings of them starting to reestablish some sort of control in eastern Russia. So these are actually significant and valid risks to take into account. However, by not supporting Ukraine to victory, it's not just Jake Sullivan, also Olaf Scholz doesn't look particularly keen. He has refused to give Ukraine, for example, the Taurus missiles, and one of the reasons for that seems to be that he is now going to position himself as a chancellor of peace, which from someone with a pro-Ukrainian perspective just seems laughable, since he's basically arguing not to help Ukraine to win. However, that is the situation. These two leaders, we'll say Joe Biden and Olaf Scholz, are not in favor of Ukraine winning because they see the risks of a Ukrainian victory as greater than the risk of Ukraine being helped to not lose but not win. However, then the question is, what is the end game if you're not helping Ukraine to victory? It would seem that is unclear, and perhaps the hope is that Russia comes to its senses, realizes that the war is just a net loss, it is a train wreck, and that they should leave. However, from Vladimir Putin's point of view, he just looks at it as, okay, well, they're not going to help Ukraine to win. That means that me, Vladimir Putin, I cannot actually lose with this strategy. Presumably, if I were about to lose the war, they would basically stop Ukraine from winning anyways. And in that case, well, I'm not really too concerned about the number of losses that Russia incurs, unless that affects my position in power in Russia. And there is obviously a connection between the two there. And I can still just fight on in spite of the huge losses, in spite of this being a train wreck of invasion, because at a certain point, I calculate that I'm going to get a new perspective from the West. They will give up. They will not last as long as me because they are too worried about the cost of the war more than Vladimir Putin is from his point of view. And eventually he will get a change in policy that will allow him to win in the long term. And that is the huge risk with this strategy, is that without a clear definition to win or objective to win the war, in the end, they're just encouraging Russia to stick at it in the hope that, well, they'll get to eventually change, or the calculation, not maybe really hope, but calculation that ultimately they will get to change the policies of countries like the US, Germany, and maybe other of Ukraine's allies, and that will play in favor of Russia actually winning in the long term. And one way to do that would be to get a cessation of hostilities to allow the Russian army to rebuild, at which point they would calculate that Western support would be less for Ukraine, and eventually they could undermine Ukraine and eventually win in the long term. So we are going to see big changes with the new American president. So one upside from a Ukrainian point of view as well, maybe the strategy would actually ultimately end up changing for Ukraine to be back to win the war. That is unlikely, judging by Donald Trump's previous statements and a lot of the people around him who tend to parrot many pro-Kremlin talking points. That doesn't seem to be what the strategy is like to be in the beginning of the Trump presidency. He has, of course, boasted that he can end the war in 24 hours, and that which basically indicates he wants a very quick deal, which, from Vladimir Putin's point of view, that's great, because then he will see that as they're desperate to get a cessation of hostility. So he's in a position where he feels that he can negotiate one that's going to be in Russia's advantage to win the war ultimately. And there is also going to be elections in Germany. However, in Germany, it is more likely that there will be a new coalition led by the CDU, which is the conservative opposition in Germany. And if that happens to be the case, then they are more in favor of backing Ukraine to actually win than the current German government. So it's a bit unclear with the changes in administrations in these two allies what will happen in 2025. The Russian economy is looking in a pretty bad place at the moment. They're also running lower on Soviet-era stocks of materiel, so military equipment and voluntary manpower. They have got perhaps a partial solution in that in North Korean troops that they have invited in to the Russian, to fight alongside the Russian military, but we have to see what will happen in 2025. So that's today's video. In short, under the Biden administration, and in particular with Scholz in power in Germany, one could say that there is not a clearly defined strategy from Ukraine's major allies for Ukraine to win. That is different, I should point out, let's say, maybe the United Kingdom, which is a lot more in favor of Ukraine winning, and the Baltic states and Poland, for example. France, a little less clear about where they stand. And then obviously Hungary and Slovakia have governments that are very favorable to Russia relative, so they definitely are not in favor of Ukraine winning the war, from what we can see. So a little bit of ambiguity about what is going to happen in 2025. However, right now, it seems clear that under the Biden administration, there was not a clearly defined strategy for Ukraine to win the war. That would seem counterintuitive to US interests. However, they are more concerned about the possible negative consequences of a Ukrainian victory. Obviously, you probably guessed from my point of view that I think the risk of not allowing Ukraine win increases the risk that Russia will win in the future, increases dramatically the likelihood, and that is a worse situation. And basically, the Soviet Union did collapse, was not without some risks that were realized in terms of war, but however, we did manage to secure the nuclear weapons. And my preference, personally, my advice would be to plan for that and how we can manage a maybe partial Russian collapse. I don't think the whole country is going to collapse out, in the space of 6 months into 100 new countries or something, but there is potential for secession movements, and it would be wise to start to plan for that possibility.